So today we're going to talk about primarily point of view in tense. So we talked about point of view a while back, very briefly. So today, as we have taken a little bit, we have gone a little bit further in the process of story writing. We would like to take a deeper dive with point of view. And then now that you're ready to develop your story, you are at a point where you're also deciding probably which tense should I write my story in. Should I choose present tense or should I choose past tense? So we will get into that today. Like we always have, so we will have a feedback on assignment 6 from our session 6. And obviously we'll cover point of view like I just mentioned and the tense. And then we will also cover how to end your story. And that's important for the reasons that we are shortly going to talk about. So feedback on assignment 6, again, all of you really did well. And I really mean it. I think you all understood the concept of hook. You all understood that it has to be crisp, succinct, and it has to really grab readers' attention right away. So hopefully it was helpful. It was something that some of you did not think about earlier. And as part of this course, you understand how important it is to start your story or your book with a hook, with the door that we talked about, that everybody would want to enter and continue going. Right? Now, only feedback I have on assignment 6 is in some assignments, what I saw was after the hook, the sentence or two, the next paragraph was totally disconnected. So in those cases, the hook was used more like what you might have at the back cover of the book, and then story starts. So that's not how we should do it. Your hook is part of your story. So it starts at the hook and then it continues. And that was the reason, primary reason, why I asked you guys to also do the next paragraph, because it's very important to not to look at hook as in isolation, not to look at your hook in isolation, but look at it as something that grabs the attention of the reader and continues from there. So there should not be a feeling of a disconnect after your hook. That hook is talking about something and suddenly, abruptly, there's something else going on there. So I have left comments wherever that happened. Please make sure that either you work on your hook or you work on your first paragraph after that to address that. Other than that, everything was very good, perfect. So I really like the way you guys are learning. So we talked about point of view earlier in this course very briefly, and I've reproduced this slide from that particular session just to ground you again into what we talked about at that point. So the multiple point of views that you will hear outside of these four, but these four are the pillars, the most primary point of views. And then there are variations of these or mixes of these that exist. So let's go through them once again very quickly. So on the right, you will see that we have a scale which goes from low to high, which is saying which is measuring the extent to which the reader actually comes to know the thoughts, the inner thoughts of the characters, or the extent to which narrator is sharing the inner thoughts of the characters, right? So if you just write from the point of view of an observer, you're basically just relaying what is happening. So you're not translating anything, you're not trying to analyze anything, you're just telling what's going on, right? So this is a very important point of view, which is just like, imagine a camera put somewhere in the market and everything is getting captured in the camera, and then camera plays it back to you. It's almost like that. So it has a very low degree, as you can see on the right hand side of the scale. It's the lowest degree of knowing the inner thoughts of the characters, right? And an example I had here was her parents hadn't wished her happy birthday yet. It was late in the afternoon and she was lying in her bed thinking. So in this case, the narrator is not even saying she's sad, because there's no way for an observer to really say that, right? Unless she's demonstrating it very visibly. So next one is third person limited. So this is, imagine this as a little bit extension of observer. So here narrator is really being an observer plus adding his own or her own impressions on it, right? So this is next level of knowing the inner thoughts, because at least you're getting a little bit further on what somebody is thinking, what characters are thinking, right? So narrator is trying to speak on behalf of the characters and how they are thinking. So the example here is her parents totally forgot her 13th birthday. She did not seem very happy about it, right? So this is narrator's interpretation, and narrator is adding a layer of explanation on top of observing, right? And this is a very effective device sometimes when you have what they call untrusted narrator. So sometimes you may want to write about a story where narrator is also playing a role in terms of sharing with you what you know uh, he or she wants to share, or not sharing with you what he or she doesn't want to share, and you discover that at some point in the story, right? So that's second one. And as you can see in first one, observer doesn't do any interpretations, any translations and things like that. Third person limited imposes his or her point of view, explanations, interpretations. Then third one is first person. And this is next level of knowing inner thoughts, right? Because narrator is telling his or her internal thoughts, making you aware exactly how he or she is feeling, exactly how he or she interpreting situations, exactly what he or she is going to do, right? So from the example of the camera, understand that now you have a camera in narrator's brain, and you basically getting live telecast from there. Whatever he or she is thinking is being shared with the reader, right? So this is increased degree of knowing inner thoughts compared to observer and third person limited. Then last one here is third person omniscient. So this one, like so the term omniscient comes from the term omniscience, right? Which is knowing everything. And generally that capability is attributed to God, right? God knows everything, without getting into whether God exists or not, obviously. So third person omniscient is like God. So narrator knows everything. Doesn't matter who is the character, what character is doing, the narrator knows everything about their inner thoughts, right? So this is kind of narration where if you have 20 characters, you pretty much know everything about each one of them, how they're thinking, in what situation, how they're reacting, what they're going to do, what their inner motives are. So that's why this is the highest degree of inner thoughts, knowing inner thoughts of your characters. So hopefully this is helpful. Putting a scale, we didn't do it last time, but I thought it might be useful for you, knowing that, you know, if you really want to make a choice based on how much you're going to reveal about characters' inner thoughts, this is where you come and make a choice about it. And you need to know that your choice is really based on what you're going to write and how you're going to write, how you're thinking about your end product, what is the audience you're going to serve, and what kind of story you're telling. There is nothing wrong or right with any one of these. But if you should be writing in third person omniscient, and if you're writing rather in observer mode, your story is not going to work. Right? So, Shreya, like you said earlier, that it was very useful to know genres, because otherwise you won't know whether your story is going to be targeted for certain kind of readers. It is very vital to know genres that you're going to write in, or if you make some exceptions, at least know about them and be careful about handling them. This is similarly very vital aspect and very foundational and fundamental to story writing. So if you choose a different narration, different point of view, your end product will look so different, totally different. And sometimes, because of not doing the right choice of narration, it may not even meet the standard of your quality. So it may not be as good as story it could be. So if you look at this, I captured this in another slide just to bring the point home. So point of view, a deeper look on that, inner thoughts. So if you go through each one of these, and in terms of inner thoughts, that's primarily the basic distinction factor here. So observer, in case of observer, the narrator only relays what he or she sees, right? Without adding his or her own interpretation. So if you look at the way I describe parallel with a camera, you can imagine this as a camera just being fixed somewhere, and camera is recording whatever is playing in front of it, and you can replay that same thing, right? So very effective for storytelling. It doesn't mean that narrator is not really getting into inner thoughts of characters, won't make a great story. A lot of times in series Games of Thrones, this is a very effective device. They just show you what's going on, right? And you keep guessing, like what will a character do, whether character is really having good intentions or not having good intentions, right? So very effective device. On the face, it may seem like this is the least attractive one, this is probably the worst one, but that's not the case. All of them, each one of them is equally powerful, depends on what kind of story you're telling. So this one is very effective, again, when you want the readers to guess a lot more, and you're just telling them what characters are doing, what situations are coming into play, without adding any interpretations, any inner thoughts and things like that, right? Second one is third person limited. So narrator relates to what is going on, relates that to their own thoughts, feelings, and knowledge. And then they kind of relay based on their interpretation. So if you compare that with my analogy about camera, you can consider that it's like same as observer. You put a camera out there, but then before showing the video to somebody, you edit it. You insert few things, you kind of do some graphic on it. So make it the way you want it to look, right? So add your own flavors, spices to it as a narrator and present it to the reader or the viewer of the movie. Now, I would again say this is a very effective device if you want to come across as non-trustworthy narrator, right? So you can definitely lie to your readers, right? And readers may discover it later on. Now, that kind of writing is very clever and very, very hard, but it happens. Then comes first person. So narrator knows all the inner thoughts and feelings about himself, herself. So as you know, first person is I, whatever, whoever is writing will refer to himself or herself and all the inner thoughts that are going, in her or his brain, and how he or she is interpreting situations, how he or she is feeling, is going to react, and all of that. So that's first person. Now, with the camera analogy, you can consider that or think of that as the camera being installed in that person's brain. So that person can tell you everything that she or he is going through, right? So inner feelings, inner thoughts, what he or she is going to do next, how he or she interpreting something, and then also how others are coming across. So in that way, she will be very much like third person limited, right? So when you write in first person, you write everything how you feeling, the narrator, but then you start guessing things, yeah, about others, or you are somewhere, observer, somewhere as third person limited. It's your choice. But first person writing also have elements of the first two, because you will always think about what's going around and have your own interpretation of it, or may not. You just state the facts there. So you may go to observer, third person limited, or can go back and forth as you write first person. But primarily, you're explaining a lot that is going through your brain. That's why it is called first person. So we get a lot of insights into narrator's mind. All right. Then last one here is third person omniscient. So in this case, like I said, narrator knows everything about every character. Doesn't matter where that character is. Now, narrator always has a choice to tell you what he or she wants to tell, right? But in this case, at least he or she pretends that he or she can get in the brains of all characters, right? And tell you what they're thinking, what they're doing, how they're feeling. And if you think about camera analogy, you think about a camera is installed in the brain of each character. So the narrator can actually see what's going on in each of their minds. All right. So it's a kind of important concept. So I would open up for questions. Anyone, any questions on concept of point of view?
I have a question.
Sure.
So, when I write, I like to describe what's happening a lot, but then I also like to leave a lot of room for like someone to interpret what's happening. So, like, what do you think would be the best point of view to use for that?
Yeah, so it again depends what kind of writing you're doing. And I've said that before, it depends is how it starts every time, because everything is very contextual when you think about art or writing or anything related to art. So if you are writing, I think first thing you want to really think about, how much are you getting into minds of people? That's the first question you ask yourself, right? So if you're going to get a lot into minds of people, all the characters and really show your reader what exactly they're thinking, then you start with third person omniscient, right? Because you want your reader to know exactly what they're thinking. And many of the, I would say, um, literary fiction is third person omniscient because the writers typically explain a lot why characters are feeling certain way, how they're feeling, what they're thinking, what they're going to do, right? Now, that doesn't mean that's the best out of these four. It totally depends on what kind of writing you want to do, right? So in your case, you said that you want to relay the action that is going on, explain a little bit, and then leave it to imagination as well. So I would say third person limited will be very good for you because I didn't hear that you want to get personally involved, right? So you want to really say, hey, I'm feeling bad. I started this day and I'm going to do this. I find this place to be bad for me, and I don't know how I landed here. This is what I'm going to do. So I didn't hear that you said it was very self-focused, right? So I would say third person limited, where you can relay events as they're happening, right? And then you can add your own explanation and you can omit things that you don't want to share at certain point with the reader and bring them later, right? And you can do that even with other voices as well, but that's a very effective voice for what you're trying to achieve. Third person limited is what I would say will work for you.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
I have a question.
Go on.
So, what if you would like to present the main characters' feelings and what they're thinking, but not really all the characters of the story?
Yeah, so that I would say third person omniscient. The moment you go beyond first person, right? So person is you telling the story, and
Yeah.
that's only one person inner thoughts of. The moment you go beyond that, you land into third person omniscient, because then you have somebody else other than you know everything about, right? So think about that God analogy again. So in order to know anybody else's thoughts other than yours, you need to be God. So you need to be third person omniscient. Make sense?
So that would be considered for. So if it's like if you want to limit it to the main character, meaning like if a certain event is happening and you and like a side character, like a confidant, comes, but you don't really want to feature their feelings and thoughts, but only your character's feelings and thoughts.
Yeah, that's a good question. So basically, if I can summarize it, so you're saying that it's not the person who's telling the story, but you're telling about, the main character as third person, and then you necessarily may not expand that to other characters in the book. I think it still qualifies a third person omniscient.
How can you write third person omniscient into your story in a way that does not require you to switch the character's perspective every chapter?
How do you want to write what?
Third person omniscient?
Oh, third person omniscient. It doesn't have anything to do with chapter changes, right? So it could be same chapter, and just tell me if I got your question still wrong. So the question you're asking is that third person omniscient, do we change chapters when we bring in inner thoughts of different characters? um, no, and mostly not, because you can imagine your characters are sitting in a bar talking about some topic, and you can explain how different characters are feeling about certain situation, right? You can describe how Alice is thinking about it. You can describe how Tom is thinking about it and what they're thinking. Maybe one of them is thinking that after this session, he or she is going to punch, the other guy in the face as they go out, right? You can do all of that. So it does not really stop you to kind of show that glimpse. It's all about the very foundational structure of a story, that are you revealing about their inner thoughts, right? Or are
Okay.
you limiting it to yourself as narrator, or are you interpreting their thoughts, or are you just observing, right? It doesn't have anything to do with chapters or paragraphs or anything else. It's very foundational, that you know what they're thinking, basically, in third person omniscient. Make sense?
Yeah.
All right, sounds good. So let's, in the interest of time, let's keep going. So then let's talk about tenses, because this is another thing that I wanted you guys to naturally stumble on instead of first covering it. And it's important, because if you stumble on things and you have a little bit of struggle, then you understand that handling that is important, or the need to handle that is important, right? So there are only two kinds of tenses that are predominant in writing: present tense and past tense. And I would tell you, I don't have a number, but majority of writing, specifically, not if you just skip last 10 years, because last 10 years have, some change in trend. Most of the writing has happened in past tense, right? Recently, there has been more and more writing using present tense. All right, so before we get into details of what you should be using and what it really means, let's look at the full picture of the verb tenses in English. So here is the full picture of verb tenses in English. So primarily three tenses at a high level, past, present, future. You can see an example here. I'm not going to go into too much details here. So when you have done something and you're talking about it, that's past tense. So you say, I wrote the letter yesterday. Present tense, you say, I write letters every day. And future tense, I will write more letters tomorrow. So one thing that I want you to understand here, a lot can get lost in translation, right? So I wrote the letter yesterday. So this person is saying, I just wrote one letter. But present tense, when you convert that, it may become, I write letters every day. But if you want to keep the intent that you just wrote one letter, you might say, I write this letter right now, right? Or something like that. But the thing that you should notice is that the tenses, choice of tense, does huge thing to your writing. And that's why it is very important to choose it wisely, right? They have some constraints that come along with them that we will go in much further details, but know that choice of tense is not something optional. And I'll say that again. Choice of the right tense is not something optional. Choice of right tense, like every other element we have talked about, which is essential for your writing, is based on what you want to write, right? All right, so the reason I wanted to show this picture to you guys is there are totally 12 tenses. If you look at, all the forms of these three basic tenses: simple, continuous, perfect, and perfect continuous. So total number of tenses here are 12. The reason I want to show this to you, based on what kind of tense you choose for your writing, your choices become limited in some cases, right? So you may not be able to use all of these, right? While if you choose other kind of tense, you have more freedom to make more choices. So I'm not going to cover past tense writing. It's very prevalent. All of you, I'm sure, have read a lot about it. It's not as controversial as present tense writing. Let me say that the present tense writing is in a way controversial. Writers often use this, the present tense writing, because it feels most film like. So a lot of writers today, they write thinking that they want to see their writing as a movie, which was not something 20 years ago, right? So more and more movies are based on books, and kind of make that kind of makes many writers think about their books to be very much geared toward a movie like thing, right? And writing in present tense helps that, because you are describing constant action. You're describing as somebody is watching constantly in the present tense, right? You're watching the movie and things are going in front of you, right? Intensifies the emotions. Readers feel more part of the experience, right? So it feels like a movie. And as a reader, you almost seeing the action in front of you and you feel like you're more part of it. As opposed to past tense, where somebody is describing what happened 20 years ago or yesterday or 3 days ago, right? It's not happening in present, right? So that brings some level of intensity, which is higher than, when you use the past tense. Deep point of view is often used as narrative style. So now you would wonder, what is deep point of view? So we talked about 4 point of views. So deep point of view is really like first person narrative, but it is, you know, covered from perspective of different um, characters in the work, right? So the narrative is written in third person, I would say omniscient, but description is more like each character is a describing, or somebody describing for each character, very much like first person. So just convert I into he or she or name. So many of the present tense writings use the deep point of view, which is a fusion of first person narrative and third person omniscient, right? Now, you don't have to pay a lot of attention to this here. I just wanted to mention it for those of you who can relate it with, that setting in most of the present tense writings or, movies that you've seen. But if you, can't relate with this, you can skip this for now. Use best for short time frame stories with constant action. So present tense, when you use it, you always choose it when it's a short time frame, because time is one thing that is very hard to handle when you're writing in present tense. So for example, you can say 10 years later, I realized that this was not true. How would you say that in present tense? 10 years later, I am going to realize this is not true. How can you say that? Right? There are ways to say that. There are ways to kind of communicate everything in present tense as well, but it becomes very complicated at times. It becomes really hard. And while present tense is easiest to write for the kind of stories that you should be writing in present tense, right? Short time frames, a lot going on in front of you. It is the hardest one to write when you have to really write something that has time gaps, is dealing with time and things like that, right? So just think about that. Some readers hate present tense, and I've been, little generous here in saying some readers. I would say a lot of readers hate present tense, right? And here is one quote from an author that I have used, right? So the thing here is that many readers they miss the bite, essentially. So they're feeling that they're not getting enough in present tense because the descriptions are not that much. It's all about what's going on. You're almost very close to being an observer, right? Less flexible, time shifts may come across as awkward. You are logged in present. You limit your ability to move through the time freely. So I already talked about this. It's very inflexible. When you think about time hops, events that happen on time scale, how do you represent them in a way that they make sense, right? Because remember, that's why present tense should be picked when you're thinking about short time frame. You're thinking about 2-3 days, constantly things going on, thinking about 5 years back, somebody did this to me. Now, 5 years later, we meet here and talk about it. Those kind of complex scenarios are not very suitable for present tense writing. And no to very little narration, self-explanatory. There's not, lot of descriptions there. You are more like an observer because it's constant action that you're watching. But having said that, it's not always in the observer mode. Narrator can always tell you what's going on, going through character's mind. So everything is still applicable, but the very nature to the very nature based on where this kind of writing is applicable eliminates a lot of potential for getting deep in characters' brains. All right, harder to create complex characters, same thing. So if you can't really describe a lot, you can't really, hop um, across times, if you cannot really analyze your characters, you cannot create complex characters. And like everything is possible, so I would say you can create complex characters. When we say hard to create complex characters, is that it takes a lot of effort, multiple times more effort to create complex characters in present tense books than compared to past tense. Can often diminish suspense, right? So in present tense, action is happening in front of you. It's hard to say that. Let's imagine a very simple example, right? In a past tense, you can say, I'm telling you this, and this, as you will see, is going to have a great impact on my life. So the narrator already knows that something has happened, right? And based on that, narrator is saying, I know something has happened, which is super impactful, has been super impactful on my life, and I'm going to tell you about that. So that creates suspense. But how would you do that in present tense, right? It's very hard to do and brings similar kind of impact in present tense writing. Have access to only 4 verbs tenses. So this is why I showed you that slide. So when you're writing in present tense, you have access to only 4 of 12. You experiment with others, it will feel awkward. But when you write in past tense, you have access to all 12. So you have more freedom of writing. You have to exercise your brain less in terms of how do I capture this in present tense, right? So what tends to use? So simple guideline, and this is again not everything, but something to guide you. If you're writing a film like deep POV story, right, you choose present tense. You have unreliable narrator, you use present tense. You think about using present tense in that scenario as well. And I talked about untrustworthy narrator, so this is similar. So narrator can tell you things, which are not true, and in present tense can misguide you, right? About, first person, if a narrator himself, herself telling you a story about himself, herself, or can misguide you about other characters, and you will discover that later on. right? That was not true because it's a present tense, right? So past tense does not has this potential, but generally, um, I would say the number of books, number of stories written with unreliable narrator tend to be using present tense more. Now, past tense, everything is possible, but I would say present tense is more effective, found to be more effective to do that. The story takes place in just few days, so it has to be limited in time span. If it goes beyond, a certain time, then you will find it hard to express, narrate the story. Past tense, if your story takes place over several years, follows many point of views of characters, places a great emphasis on narration. So something that we already talked about. Now, don't change tenses within your novel unless you're breaking the fourth wall, right? So fourth wall is the wall in front of you, right? The readers. So don't change the tenses within your novel. And this is a mistake that many writers do in the beginning. They flip the tenses, and that's the last thing you want to do about your writing. Now obviously, um, when your characters speak, they speak in present tense because they are having a dialogue. So we are only talking about the setting, the narration. When we say present tense versus past tense, we are only saying that somebody is telling you something that already happened versus something is happening right now and being relayed to you. Most stories are written in past tense, so we already talked about that. So now I'm going to talk about ending story as well. But before that, I can take one question or two about the tenses.
This isn't technically about the tenses, but I was wondering if you had a chart about the different point of views that was similar to the chart you just showed us about the tenses, like when to use which one.
That's a great question. I thought about that. I'll probably put something together. I mean, it's very inherent to the story that you're writing. Um, I think that's a great idea. So let me put something together that exactly summarizes what we talked about. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions?
I just have a question.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering, sorry, I always forget my question. Okay, yeah. So I normally write my stories in present tense because so the reader can connect with the character, and because I usually write more character-driven stories. So I was just wondering if when you say that present tense is used best for action-packed kind of quick stories, are you saying that's limited to or just inclusive of?
So that's a great question, Olivia. I would say some of the best books are written in present tense that have analyzed characters really well, but very few. So when I said, when I said what I said earlier was because you think about majority, right? How majority treats, take certain thing into account. So from that perspective, most of the books that analyze characters a lot are written in past tense, but there's few books I definitely know, and they're like best examples of literary fiction. They're written in present tense. So why there are very limited number of them in present tense? The reason is it's extremely hard. If you can pull that off in present tense, it is amazing, because that's where the craft is. And I would say most of the writers struggle to achieve same level of thoroughness in present tense when analyzing a character as in past tense. So that is what it means in the end. Like I said, present tense is easy for action move, fast action, what you're observing kind of things, but is hardest when you get in the territory of literary fiction, and you get to describe how characters are feeling and things like that, because you know you have to deal with a lot of constraints that you have to overcome, and if you pull that off, it's a masterpiece. Does that answer your question? So nothing
Yeah,
is
thank you.
nothing is really do this or that in art or in writing, specifically this being a beginner's course in writing. I just don't want most of us here to get stuck, make a choice which is extremely hard, and then not being able to pull it. But if you can pull it, great.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. So ending of a story, first of all, is very important to always think about. Doesn't matter, you're beginning a story or you're middle of your story. We'll talk more about that. But let's talk about ending of a story in general, why it is important to end a story in a good way, right? So few things here. So you end your story generally with a punch, right? So the reader has invested so much time in your story, right? You want to give reader something really good at the end, right? Very important, because readers don't remember your book by first sentence. First sentence is door, always remember. It's entry door, and they will feel like reading, they will feel like going into it. But once they finish your book, they will always remember the aftertaste. And when you eat something, doesn't matter, like if you have a meal or some dish for 15 minutes, you enjoy first 14 minutes, and then 15 minutes there is this terrible aftertaste. What will you remember a week later? Will you remember those 14 minutes, or will you remember the 15th minute? So aftertaste is what really resides in you, right? So remember that the um, remember that the hook gets entry into your book, but what really sells your book is the ending. Because when you read a book and it leaves a good aftertaste, you're going to tell it to so many people because that's what you remember. But if you don't land with a good aftertaste, you're not going to suggest that book to anyone. You'll say, hey, it started well, but somewhere it lost its momentum and it was abrupt in the end, and nobody's going to pick that book because the reader feels defeated, deceived at the end if you don't give the reader payback for the time that reader has invested in your book. So just remember that. Never rush your ending. So you built up nicely and then you want to finish the book very quickly. And a lot of authors, do that. Now, again, this is not in contradiction of like mysteries, for example, where you build to the climax and then you quickly end because everything is discovered. That's totally fine. But in general, there is an observation that authors write good books, but they finish very abruptly, right? So readers don't feel good about that. Make it unpredictable but fair. You want readers to feel they should have seen it coming because you planted enough hints, but not feel hoodwinked. This is extremely important, right? Even with the suspense, thriller, mysteries, right? It is fine to surprise them, but surprise them within what they anticipate, right? What makes sense. If you really, if you, for example, you have a realistic fiction, and then in the end you have angel coming from nowhere and help the protagonist solving the case or resolve the situation, do you think anybody's going to like it? No, because nobody could even in dream imagine that would happen. But if you build magic realism in your story, you can get that done, right? So think about that. Make it unpredictable so that they're not thinking, okay, I know what is going to happen. The readers would think, okay, this, I know where it is going. So that shouldn't happen. But at the same time, you should make it weird, awkward, abrupt, right? Remember that example of like the protagonist is fighting in the battle and suddenly an angel comes and saves, who were never nowhere in the book earlier. That's an extreme example, but you get the point. Brainstorm, so don't jump on the first idea that comes to your mind. It's like very similar to everything we do in writing. So you think about ending, think about 5 endings, and then leave it to yourself, right? Brainstorm and choose the best writing ending for you. And then be succinct. So don't describe, explain, or have philosophy in there. You have entire book to do that. Never do that at the end, right? You know, you still see movies and books that have a lot of explanation in the court in the end, but that is still part of climax, because you know there are things that are going to be revealed. So that doesn't qualify what we have here, but this is more about, you have to be succinct about the ending. You cannot go on and write paragraphs after paragraphs about somebody's behavior or things like that. So ending has to be very, very crisp and succinct. So why think of ending throughout the story? So you have to keep ending in sight at all times. Doesn't matter whether you know it or don't know it, you have to challenge yourself. There is no way. Your ending may change in the end, or it may change as you write, and you always go back and say, now based on where I am, I would rather choose this ending, right? So everything in writing is iterative. It keeps changing. The entire book, every element can change, right? But there has to be an end. You should have an end in mind, because then if you don't have, you don't know where you're going. Imagine if you don't know the destination, you might make bad choices, right? And they may not lead you at destination 1. And even if they lead you at destination, you might not have been consistent throughout the book about leading to that destination. So put a destination in there that is ending, and be open to change that ending based on how your story or book is progressing. But what that does to your writing is, really at any point of time you have sense of direction. You reveal inconsistent elements always that are in your story, and the issues will constantly surface that you would otherwise won't know, right? So always have end in mind, and even write end of your story, just like you wrote hook right in the beginning, and then keep changing it, right? So at any given point of time, you know how to draw a line. If you know your current state and you know your future state, you can draw a line and you know which direction that line points in. But if you don't know your future point, you cannot draw a line, and then you can go in any direction not knowing where the destination is, right? So it's that kind of a thing. Put a point, so that you can start moving in that direction, and that direction can change based on your endpoint. Your endpoint is going to change, but at least at any given point of time, you have a direction. So here are some examples of closing sentences. So when I said ending, I meant the real ending, last 2-3 pages of your book. But then closing sentence is equally important, like a hook. Like I said, when you really finish the book in last sentence, you make that impact on reader's mind. So it is extremely important. And I would like you to consider a number of closing sentences that I have at the reference, in the reference at the end of this particular presentation, but I have listed few here. So if you look at these, I'm not going to read through them. If you look at these, you will find they communicate a lot. They are very succinct, and they, in some ways, summarize the whole book, right? And they have a definitive end. I never leave your reader in a feeling that it didn't end, even if there is a sequel to come, or even if there's a cliffhanger. There is an end to book, right? So I'm not going to go through each one of these. You guys have a look at these. These are some great example of closing sentences. Now consider for ending. Here are some questions you should ask. What readers say about after they put your book down matters more for your sales than what they say when they pick it up, right? So again, like I said, aftertaste is what matters. So when they put your book down, how they're feeling. Blow away your readers, simple as that. No incident that precedes the closer should be more exciting. This is the payoff for your fiction, right? Is the conflict resolved in the end? Ask yourself that question. Are you introducing new material? You should not. So you shouldn't be introducing anything new at the end, because your readers won't like it. It's abrupt. Is there a lot of explaining in the end? Avoid it. Is the conclusion logical? All that goes before should point to ending, and ending should be reasonable. Does the ending leave us feeling a sense of wonder? Your story will be judged by its final impression, not its first. So when they start eating, you start eating something good, it looks good, tastes good, but then if it leaves bad after taste, that's what you're going to remember. So that's what this is all about. What will readers tell their friends after they put down your story? Like, always ask these questions to yourself. So now on to homework. So you need to come up with point of view you're going to be adopting for your story, right? And in some way you already chose that, as you chose the hook and the first paragraph. I want you guys to look at it more critically, and I want you guys to change it if it has to be changed, right? Because remember, it's only one paragraph, it's only small rework now, but you don't want to do that later on. So I wanted you guys to get started and then realize that the current choice may not work. If it works, that's fine. So you have to list what point of view you're going to use for your story, and think about it. Just don't pick what you already have in there. Everything we have talked about today, just think about that. And then if you have to change it, then change it. What tense are you adopting for your story? Again, same thing. Don't just go by what you have already. Think about everything we have talked about, and then think about choosing the tense. Write the last sentence of your story. I really want you guys to do it. It may sound crazy, but like I said, you have to start working on it right away, right? And that guides a lot of things that you're going to write in the middle. Because if you write things in the middle, you're lost in the end. You're like, what am I going toward? But if you write ending and end sentence, starting now, and refine it, then you have direction at every given point of time. And then write the paragraph before last sentence of your story. So same thing, right? I asked you to write the hook, and then I asked you to write next sentence after the hook for continuity. I want you to also do that here. So as part of a home assignment, you're writing what point of view you're adopting. You're telling us what tense are you going to be writing in. Then you are going to write the last sentence of your story. And then you're writing a paragraph that is before that last sentence of your story. And it is hard, I understand. Some of you might not even thought about it, but that's the whole idea. You cannot go sequentially. You cannot think, hey, so first scene, second scene, third scene. The day you are linear about story writing, you're dead as a writer, right? So you have to think about all elements at all times. And ending is one of the most crucial elements, because if you don't think about it, you might venture into territories which will make it hard for you to arrive at your destination. All right. With that, two references here. I would highly encourage you guys, all of you guys, because you did a great job with Hook. And I think it was very clear. Some of you ran through examples. It was very evident. And I really want you guys to go through the best endings. They're not probably best, because it's somebody's list, but still good enough to go through and see how these 50 books have ended, right? And then 100 best closing lines. Look at them and see how impactful those closing lines are. The closing lines have to be very impactful. All right. So with that, I'm going to open up for questions. So unmute yourself and ask me any questions you guys have.
Earlier when you're talking about endings, you mentioned like doing an unexpected ending. Do you have any advice for how to write a good plot twist, or is that going to be coming up in another session?
Yeah, so so I think it ties back to the different kinds of writing that we talked about. So it depends on whether you're writing a mystery, or if you're writing a literary fiction, or if you're writing a thriller. It really depends on that. I can share some material that will help you with that. I think it's a very relative term, depending on what kind of writing you're doing. So there are no set rules here, but there's some guidance that definitely you can consider. So I can send you some references that will help there.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions you guys have for me? All right. Thank you all. Have a great rest of your weekend, and sorry for running over again a little bit. You guys have a great weekend.
Thank you.
You too.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.